Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unpack complex topics, helping you get well informed fast.
Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, maybe a bit unsettling too. Dark tourism.
Yeah, it's a topic that seems to really capture people's interest, and we've got quite the mix of sources to draw from, haven't we?
We really do. Academic papers, travel guides, articles, even a Reddit thread. So a really varied perspective on why people are drawn to these sites, places linked to death, disaster, difficult history.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, try and make sense of it all. What's really driving people, especially younger visitors, according to some sources, to go to these often quite somber destinations?
But what are the experiences actually like when they get there? What kind of feelings come up?
Plus the big questions, right? The ethical stuff, the controversies these visits can spark.
Exactly. It's definitely complex. So let's unpack it.
Right. So maybe the best place to start is, what is it? What exactly are we talking about when we say dark tourism?
Well, the sources define it pretty clearly. At its heart, it's basically touristic travel to sites that are associated with death or what's often termed difficult heritage.
Okay, difficult heritage. And this idea, it's not brand new in academic circles, is it? Though maybe the term dark tourism is more recent.
That's right. The sources mention pioneers like Lenin and Tholi, who used that specific term, dark tourism, and also Seaton, who talked about thanatourism.
Thanatourism, right? Is there a difference there?
Well, there's some debate, Some researchers suggest thanatourism might focus more on older sites, maybe visited for more contemplative reasons, while dark tourism sometimes gets linked more to the commodification, the selling of more recent events.
Though older sites can definitely be commercialized too.
Oh, absolutely. And Thanatos, that comes from the Greek for death, so maybe it was chosen for that slightly more academic feel, perhaps.
Gotcha. But what really jumps out from the sources is that this isn't just one single type of place. They talk about a spectrum, different shades of dark tourism.
Exactly. It's definitely not a monolith. It covers a huge range.
So can you walk us through some examples, sort of paint a picture of that spectrum?
Sure. So on one end, maybe what you'd call the darkest end, you've got sites directly commemorating atrocities, barbarism. Think of the dark camps of genocide, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, sites really dedicated to remembering horrific events.
Heavy stuff. And then moving slightly along.
Then you have sites marking human tragedy, natural disasters, memorials, like the 9/11 Memorial in New York is mentioned, or the August 7th Memorial Park in Nairobi from the bombing there.
Ah, okay.
Or the Chernobyl exclusion zone, L'Aquila in Italy after the earthquake, Aberfan in the UK, places dealing with specific disasters.
Right. And prisons seem to fit in here somewhere too.
Definitely. Prisons and dungeons are a distinct category, and this itself is a spectrum, right? From very real historical prisons like Sucha Gestapo prison in Warsaw or Port Arthur in Australia.
Robben Island, Alcatraz.
Exactly. All the way to places that are much more about entertainment, like the London Dungeon. Very different vibe.
Okay. What else falls under this umbrella?
Well, there are dark resting places, cemeteries, basically.
Oh,
Big
fun.
famous ones like Recoleta in Buenos Aires, Père Lachaise in Paris. Even celebrity grave sites in Hollywood get mentioned.
Interesting.
And some sources also group in sites with visible human remains or specific cultural practices around death, like places with embalmed leaders, Ho Chi Minh, Lenin, or the Sokushinbutsu monks in Japan, or even observing cremations in Bali or India.
Wow. Okay. And then you get into the more supernatural side.
Yeah, haunted attractions in forests, places with ghost stories attached like Barren Palace in Egypt, or legends swirling around them like Germany's Black Forest with its witch stories.
Winchester House, the Queen Mary ship, those kinds of places.
Exactly. And these can be really highly produced, very theatrical, or they might aim for a more quote-unquote authentic spooky feel.
And true crime pops up too.
Yes, things like guided tours focusing on historical crimes. The Jack the Ripper walks in London are a classic example mentioned in the sources.
Okay. And one last category that was interesting, existing heritage sites changing their story.
Right. This is where conventional heritage sites kind of darken their narrative, as one source puts it. They confront difficult parts of their past. Broadsworth Hall in the UK is the example given. They put on an exhibition acknowledging the estate's links to the transatlantic slave trade.
So they're actively scripting that difficult history into the visit.
Precisely. It shows how heritage sites are increasingly grappling with these complex, sometimes uncomfortable histories.
Wow, okay. That is a huge range. I mean, from Auschwitz to a cemetery walk to a haunted house. So, given how incredibly varied these places are, what do the sources tell us about why people go? What are the motivations? Because that seems key.
It really is. And the
Wow.
sources are clear. It's complex. There's no single answer. And it's still an area researchers are digging into. Motivations vary a lot between individuals, and they definitely depend on the type of site.
But there must be some common threads. What's maybe the most basic driver?
Curiosity. Simple as that, often. Just a fundamental interest in the unusual, the abnormal, maybe the macabre, even death itself.
And for those haunted places, curiosity about the supernatural.
Absolutely. Interest in the paranormal is a big driver for those kinds of attractions.
Okay, curiosity. Makes sense. But surely, especially for the really serious sites, there's more going on.
Oh, definitely. Learning and education are huge motivators mentioned across the board. People genuinely want to understand what happened, learn about history, tragedies, different cultural perspectives on death.
So even if it's not why they first decide to go, the learning part becomes important once they're there.
Exactly. The sources suggest education is often a really vital part of the experience, even if it wasn't the initial hook. And some places, like the Holocaust Museum Houston or the Aberfan Memorial, are explicitly designed around education and remembrance.
What about connecting emotionally? Empathy.
Yes, that comes up too.
Oh.
Empathy and compassion, a desire to sort of identify with victims, understand their suffering, or just express sympathy.
Okay.
Right.
Now, shifting gears completely. What about just the thrill of it?
Yes. Thrill and entertainment, that's definitely a factor, especially for certain types of sites. There's a known link, right, between violence and entertainment in our culture.
Sure.
So some dark tourism taps into that.
Mm-hmm.
Seeking excitement, spooky feelings, maybe experiencing fear, but in a safe, controlled way. Take haunted houses, ghost tours, that whole horror recreational entertainment industry is a big part of this.
Right. So you've got the deep, serious stuff like learning and empathy, and then the more entertainment-driven thrill-seeking. Where does remembrance fit?
Remembrance and commemoration are really powerful, especially for sites linked to genocide or major disasters. People go to pay homage, to remember the dead, to take part in acts of memorialization.
And maybe a sense of obligation or wanting to ensure it doesn't happen again?
Yes. Often there's an underlying hope that remembering and learning can help prevent future tragedies.
Contemplation seems like it would fit in too, like you mentioned with cemeteries.
Exactly. Reflecting on life, on mortality, feeling a connection to people from the past. Cemeteries, the sources note, can really offer that space for quiet contemplation.
And sometimes it's more personal, a direct link.
Yes, heritage and identity can be strong motivators. Visiting sites linked to your own family background, your culture, religion, ethnicity, that could be the actual place. Or maybe a museum representing that history.
Nostalgia also came up, which feels a bit different.
It does, a connection to the past. Sometimes the sources link it to this idea in postmodern society that we lack a sense of history, that we're stuck in the now. So visiting these places offers a link back.
Okay. And this one seemed counterintuitive, escape and relaxation at a dark tourism site.
Yeah, it sounds odd, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the sources mention it as a potential benefit identified at some places, like Recoleta Cemetery. Maybe it's the quietness, the sense of history, offering an escape from the everyday hustle, a moment of peace.
And finally, just hanging out with people.
Right. Social reasons. Visiting is a leisure activity,
Yeah.
something to do with friends or family.
So a real mixed bag of reasons. Do we know much about who is visiting? Any patterns?
Well, some studies suggest that people who've actually heard of the term dark tourism tend to be younger and maybe more educated. There are also hints, and it's just hints of potential differences based on gender.
Like
Maybe women being slightly more driven by empathy, men by intellectual curiosity, and maybe age differences too. Older visitors perhaps valuing remembrance more, while younger ones value both the emotional and educational aspects. But these are just preliminary findings, really.
So it's a mix of internal drives, the push factors like curiosity or wanting to learn, and things about the destination itself, the pull factors like its history or how it's presented.
Exactly. It's definitely not one size fits all, which leads us nicely into what the experience is actually like.
Yeah. Okay, so we know the what and the why, but what's it feel like to be at one of these places? The sources stress it's not simple.
Not at all. They describe it as complex, multi-layered, sometimes really profound, not superficial, even at the places that seem more entertainment-focused. And of course, how you experience it depends hugely on why you went, your background, any personal connection who you're with.
Emotions must be right at the center of it.
Absolutely central. And it's a huge range, both negative and positive, often mixed together. The sources list things like Misery, sympathy, disgust, anger, sadness, shock,
Right, the expected ones, maybe.
but also things like anticipation, excitement, unease, fascination, even awe, or a feeling of oneness with nature at some sites, or that connection across time.
It's interesting. The sources mention that expectations play a role, but some people go in quite open, just wanting to feel whatever the place evokes.
Yes, like in that Barren Palace study, participants felt their emotions were genuinely linked to the site's history, not just pre-programmed.
And for the thrill seekers at haunted attractions, feeling scared is the point, right?
Exactly. Experiencing fear, but knowing you're safe, that's the core appeal. That's what that whole horror entertainment sector provides.
And this was fascinating. Sometimes having a negative emotional experience, like feeling sad or shocked, can actually lead to positive word of mouth. How does that work?
It's because these aren't always about pleasure. Right. They're non-hedonic, as the researchers say. Satisfaction comes from something else, maybe the meaning, the connection, the intensity. So a powerful, even difficult emotional reaction can feel valuable, meaningful, something you want to talk about.
That makes sense. And how the site is presented must make a massive difference to that experience.
Oh, fundamentally. The sources give examples like the Holocaust Museum, Houston. They had this passport experience where you follow one person's story, someone matched to your age and gender. These kinds of experiential exhibits can create a really powerful personal link.
But presentation can be tricky, like the Jack the Ripper tours again. How do they frame it?
Exactly. Is the focus just on the killer, making the victims feel like touristic commodities, as one source puts it, kind of Disneyfying the horror? Or does the tour focus more on the social context, the women's lives, the history of the area? That framing dramatically changes the experience.
And it also affects that sense of distance, maybe.
Yes, the temporal distance. Visiting long after the event lets you get close to death and tragedy, but from what the sources call a safe distance. You're engaging with it, but you're not in it.
Okay. So thinking about engaging with the past, how does all this connect with what we normally think of as heritage tourism? Are they related? Separate?
That's a really interesting point, and the sources say it's debated and maybe understudied. Some argue, look, people have always visited sites of death, battlefields, tombs, execution sites. It's not new. Maybe dark tourism is just a new label, a reframing, sometimes driven by media hype, for stuff that was already part of heritage travel.
And that lack of a clear line can cause friction.
It can. Apparently, some heritage professionals get worried about dark tourism, concerned about sensationalism, about trivializing history, about respect for the site.
But then again, some of the lighter dark tourism, like visiting historical cemeteries or maybe even some true crime sites, feels quite similar to heritage tourism anyway.
Exactly. And there's clearly potential for dark tourism to be educational tourism, right?
Yeah.
Linking back to that motivation, the Broadsworth Hall example, using the difficult history of the slave trade connection as a way to educate visitors. That's heritage and dark tourism overlapping.
It really sounds like you need to pull from lots of different fields to understand it properly.
Definitely. The sources stress it needs a multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah.
Tourism studies, yes, but also history, sociology, psychology, ethics.
Which brings us squarely to the challenges, because visiting these sites isn't straightforward. What are the big ethical red flags the sources raise?
This is probably the most critical area. A core dilemma is balancing tourism people's desire to visit, the economic aspects with historical preservation, and crucially, respect for victims and their families.
Right.
It forces really tough questions. Should certain sites even be tourist destinations? Especially if they're sites of recent trauma, or if visiting causes genuine offense or distress to survivors or descendants.
The Titanic shipwreck came up as an example of that tension.
Yes. It's a mass grave, fundamentally. But it's also become a destination for expeditions, for tourism. That raises profound questions about commodifying tragedy.
And that idea of commodification turning suffering into a product seems like a recurring concern.
Huge concern. Is the way the site is presented sensationalizing things? Is it exploiting the victim's stories for entertainment or profit? It's a very fine line between education and exploitation.
And visitor behavior itself can be problematic.
Absolutely. The sources mention things like taking inappropriate selfies at memorial sites. It brings up this idea researchers talk about distinguishing between primary dark tourists, who go specifically because they're interested and are often more aware and respectful.
And secondary ones.
Right. People who are just there as part of a larger trip, maybe less prepared, less aware of the site's significance or the expected conduct.
It's also important to be clear, as the sources point out, this isn't the same as danger tourism.
Good point. Dark tourism isn't primarily about putting yourself in physical danger. Yes, some sites, like Chernobyl, have specific risks that need careful management and guidance. But that's not the core definition. And things like urban exploration, urbex exploring abandoned places that has its own rules, like not causing damage, and the sources explicitly say that's not dark tourism.
Then there's the whole tricky issue of where your tourist money ends up.
Yes, the wrong support issue. Does visiting certain places mean you're inadvertently funding regimes or practices you might disagree with? The sources mention potential examples like North Korea, Uzbekistan, China, or concerns about cultural impacts, like the Tibet Railway.
That's a really personal ethical calculation for visitors, isn't it?
It is. The sources acknowledge people have different political views and will make their own choices based on where they feel their money should or shouldn't go.
And what about the people who live there? How do local communities feel when their place of tragedy becomes a tourist spot?
That's crucial, and it can change over time.
Hmm.
The sources show that initially, communities might feel resentful, like their trauma is being gouged at. But sometimes, like the example from L'Aquila in Italy, they might come to see benefits, a way to share their story, communicate what happened, maybe even find some collective processing or healing through that engagement with outsiders.
Even just getting permission to use photos for research about these places can be tough.
Right. It just underlines how many sensitive layers there are to this whole topic.
So many layers indeed. Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear dark tourism is incredibly broad, incredibly complex. It covers this vast landscape of sites, ancient battlefields, somber memorials, haunted houses, disaster zones.
And the motivations for visiting are just as varied. Everything from a deep desire to learn and remember to basic human curiosity. Maybe seeking a controlled thrill or feeling a personal connection through heritage or just wanting a moment of quiet reflection.
And the experiences people have are clearly not trivial. They can be deeply emotional, making people think, engaging them with really difficult parts of history and even our own mortality.
But as we've seen, it comes loaded with challenges. Big ethical questions about respect, about that line between commemoration and commodification, about visitor impact. It's definitely not simple.
So here's something to mull over, building on what we've discussed. If, as the sources suggest, the darkness of a place isn't inherent but is often subjective, something we collectively decide or feel, what does that say about us? About our shared human fascination with death, with tragedy, with the darker side of history, and maybe even ourselves?